All right, so now I want to make a video showing the plot techniques. Actually, so in our last video, we made a data table. Great. So now a common thing in science is you want to graph that. So what I want to do here is I want to highlight the columns I want to make in the graph. So first, I'm going to highlight the time column, and I want to be clear here. I'm highlighting all of the times at once. A common mistake is people will click this button and then do something wrong after this. So let me show you the correct way, and then I'll explain the mistake. First, highlight all these. Now press and hold Control. Now highlight the next column you want to use and the next column. If all the data is lined up like this, you could obviously just collect the whole thing at once. But this is a good technique. If you want to just do two columns that aren't next to each other, first highlight the first column, then press and hold Control after you've selected the first column. Then you could do that. Now you could make plots of different columns, even if they're not next to each other. That said, since they're all next to each other, I'm going to insert them as a single scatter plot. The most common mistake students do is they'll go up here and do a line plot. That is totally wrong. The line plot is great if everything has units of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the x-axis. Since we don't have that, what we want to do, we want to go into a scatter plot because this will do this. Now notice what I'm doing. I'm entering the scatter plot with the dots. And then we see immediately this is confusing. Whenever you have more than one data set on the same plot, that is the time to include a legend. This is very different than if you have one data set and a trend line. That's different. On that problem, you wouldn't use a legend. That said, you could do lots of different ways to do this, but I'm going to go over to here and put all the stuff on it. You could put on a title. You could put on a trend line. We don't need that in this case. You could put on error bars, which is cool. We could talk about that in another video. And in this case, you can see there's a legend here. So we do want the legend. So that's great. So how do I label this and make this look good? Right now, this looks pretty crappy. Well, let's go into here. This should be time in seconds. And so before I get too crazy, I like to pick my font. So here's a tip. First, pick your font, because if you change the font, it will get rid of some of your formatting like italics. So I like mine in Times New Roman. And if I'm going to make a presentation, usually I want to change it to 18-point font right away. Now, I know it looks a little bit bad here, but this will look great. So if you're putting this in a report, you'd use 10-point font. If you're going to put this in a presentation, you'd want to use at least 18-point font, just so this shows up better on the screen. Maybe let's use 14 today. All right, so now going back to my axis, I typed in my axis. Don't forget to italicize the axis label. Do not italicize the units. A lot of teachers like to use words here like time. I personally like to use the variables just so that everything matches the equations. On this side, this was the magnetic field in Tesla. So again, I got to remember the variable is italicized, the units are not. And so up here in the title, you could say B versus T, lowercase, for maybe this was done for a 200-gram mass or something. I don't know. Maybe there was a 200-gram mass involved in this experiment. I'm just making up stuff right now, just so there's a reason for the title here. If we just had B versus T and we only had one set of data, one could argue there's no need for a title at all. However, if we're going to be doing, like, let's say we do different plots of magnetic field versus time for different masses, then there's a good reason to have these titles, okay? So you know which one. So there's that. So notice I've used italics on all the variables. Now, let's go ahead and look at the axis labels. Notice there's some wasted space over here from about 8 to 10 and from 11 to 2. We could format that. Maybe I'll do that last. We could also do, look at this. When I click on this set of dots, notice it shows me over here that that's the theoretical. So let me, hold on a sec. Let me show you with my zoom annotation. So when I click on one of these dots, notice it shows me up here which data set I'm looking at, and I can read, oh yeah, that's the theoretical. So let me clear all that. get rid of this. And now let's go back and actually do something with this. So I'm going to right click on this. The theory, let's format this over here. And what I like to do with theoretical lines is I like to have a solid line. Down here, I like to make it smooth, and I like to get rid of the marker. Okay, so now this already looks a lot better. It's so much easier to communicate with people when you say the smooth line is the theory and the dots are the experiment. It just makes sense to people. So great. Now notice the legend isn't very instructive. So let's go into here, just click on some data point. I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit select data. When I do that, I can actually edit these things. So series 1, I'm going to edit that. And that, I believe, was the experimental values. We'll find out in a second. There we go. Here, these are going to be the theoretical values. And there are other ways to make a legend. You could put in a text box or something. But for now, this is good enough, I think. Great. Now, finally, I like to make the axes pop. So when I do that, I'm going to right-click on this. I can just click on the numbers. Sorry. Now that the formatting box is open, I could just click on these numbers. I can go into this paint box here, or paint box, and I could give this a nice black line to make the axis stand out. I'm going to click on the y-axis and do the same thing. Now I'm going to mess with these grid lines. Grid lines, that can be kind of distracting. So one thing you could do is you can thin the line out and make it a dashed. And so it's much less obtrusive. So if you're going to do grid lines, make sure they're not up in your face, covering up the data. And so I argue these grid lines are pretty reasonable. Why? Well, they're not so, whoops, let me scoot that up a little bit. They're not so dark that you are focused on them. You're focused on the data more, yet they're still convenient for reading them. So if you're going to use grid lines, try to keep them a little bit subtle like that. And let me see if I can get this to, there we go. So you could adjust your legend a little bit. I'm just trying to make that look pretty. This is already looking pretty solid right now, and I'd be pretty happy with that. If you like this kind of thing, one thing you could do at this point is you can right click and you could hit save as a template. Now, when you do this, you could save the name. That way, if you have to make more than one of these graphs, each time you could then change the graph type to your template. I'll show you that here. We'll just say greatest plot ever. All right. So we'll save that as a template. And so that's great. Now, if I want to make another one, you'll see what the shortcuts we're able to do. Finally, after you've saved your template, that's when I like to go in and adjust the axis. So again, I click on the axis down here. Let me just click somewhere else. I'm going to click on the axis. Then I go over here to the bar graph, and that allows me in axis options. I could change the number. When I do that, I could change this to a number and change the number of sig figs. Like, let's say I wanted 5 zeros. That's a little insane. In this problem, 2 is reasonable. But that's how you could change the, whoa, there we go. I could also change the tick marks, things like that. And here, why go out to 1.2 seconds when our particular data set ends at 1? That looks nice and clean. Why go up to 10? So I'm going to click on the vertical axis. I can click this again. Why go up to 10 when our data stops at 8? And maybe I liked going by units of 2, so that's cleaner. And now notice this particular one, the sig figs look a little bit wonky. So I'm going to go down here to number again. So let's say I want to change the sig figs. I click on the number. I go to the graph up here. I click axis options. Not axis options. I click number, and then I can click number, and then I could choose the number of decimal places appropriate. And I think in this case, 2 is probably fine. I know you want to have every single number on every single graph have the perfect number of sig figs. In reality, it will never happen on your axis labels because you usually get these huge ranges of numbers. So pick the number of sig figs which best represents the largest number of data points in your plot. And so right now, I think this is looking pretty good. We've got a nice graph here. If you want to fill in the legend, that's fine, but we could do this. Fill, solid fill, and maybe just make it white. There we go. And we can put a solid line around it. That way the legend really pops. This is a great graph. This is a graph showing an experimental data set plus a theoretical data set. A different type of graph has just an experimental data set and a trend line. That's a little bit different. More on that